I would never want my kids to go to school in a building like that, now looking back at it.
Like thriving and small town and really close knit until like the 80s. And then it sort of suffered this economic turmoil.
I remember like catching mice out of my stepmom's classroom. And
I think we were thought of as hicks. And I think the residents let their redneck side fly.
On November 25th, 2019, my hometown ceased to exist. The citizens of what had been the village of Amelia, Ohio for 119 years voted to dissolve the community over a 1% increase in income taxes. Now, as one of Amelia's native sons, a graduate of its schools, and at one time a fairly active young citizen, it was weird for me to wake up last November and no longer have a hometown. It's a strange thing to grieve. It has no impact on my life anymore, but it's surreal. So I decided to talk to some of my friends, classmates, and neighbors about their memories of Amelia and its legacy.
The Amelia of my childhood was very family-oriented, very community-oriented. We had a cow in our backyard. Our neighbors had horses when we were growing up. So it's really changed. It was very much, I would even call it a farming community when I was a kid.
Like thriving and small town and really close knit until like the 80s. And then it sort of suffered this economic turmoil. I feel like Amelia didn't necessarily have an identity, which is fine when, 125 was a horse route, and you were using that, to get out to the country, and it is a wide spot in the road, and it's maybe a place where you rest your horses and, or exchange something or whatever. But yeah, it's not a place, it's not a bustling place.
My husband and I would joke about it, that we would drive through and say, oh, we're in the village, oh, we're out of the village, because it's so small.
I never thought of it really as a city or a town, and Main Street never really had much besides for the elementary school and the bank that got robbed when we were in elementary school, the Dollar General, I think.
And then all of these various neighborhoods of whether they were collections of townhouses or condos or big sprawling suburban neighborhoods. And each neighborhood kind of said something about I don't know how much money you had. And that got, I think maybe we either became more aware of that as we got older, or it just became more real as we got older.
That division that Trent mentioned came up a lot. The mix of farmland and suburban subdivisions once you got past Main Street clearly marked a divide between the area's older Appalachian families and newer arrivals who moved in during the 90s and early 2000s.
It's a classic Appalachian culture mixed with a suburban culture.
Yeah, my kids said that Amelia, this was their analogy, was the haves and the have-nots. And not that you were rich, but that you were comfortable and you could afford to do things, or you didn't. And the same thing went for the parents. Either you cared or you didn't. And social economically, I think those were the same two groups.
If you lived in this place in Amelia, you knew who you were. You knew the status that you had. And if you lived in another place, you knew the status you had. I was definitely a have-not, and I knew it. Because I could look at the people who were haves.
Oh, we were the poor kids. I think they joke about it. They're like, oh, it's just Amelia, oh, well, it's okay because we're Amelia kids.
My mom did a really good job of making sure that even though she was a single mother and raised us alone for a long time, that we never really felt poor. But looking back, I was poor. There are pieces of that you just don't want to remember, like being home alone a lot. When you're probably too young to be home alone, but you didn't want to be at daycare, so your mom just let you be home,
The one thing we all had in common was school. Our schools were old, some of them dated all the way back to the 1930s. They didn't have air conditioning or matching chairs and desks, or even current textbooks, but all of that contributed to our scrappy sense of pride.
I would never want my kids to go to school in a building like that, now looking back at it. It's what we had, and it was fine and we all enjoyed it, but it was falling apart.
There was like a hole in one of the classroom walls, like through the brick walls, and you could like push a pencil through it, and you could go out in recess and get your pencil outside. And looking back, that seems like probably a problem, that there was a hole in one of the walls.
Yeah, it was fantastic. I mean, I totally understand that it was, obviously it had asbestos, and I think it had some lead in there, and it would have cost a fortune to upgrade it.
Amelia High School felt scrappy, which I think is like, I don't know, that's like this underdog like kind of like theme that I've got going in my head. Playing sports at Amelia High School, we were always the underdogs, so it was always kind of like really awesome if we won and just kind of like okay if we lost.
It was very much a rival school with Glen Estee. I mean, that was very much alive, and it was more of a competitive, we want to win because we want this bell. That meant nothing, but in retrospect, but it was all about winning the game, where I felt like when the kids were in high school, it was more of a hostility thing.
But much of that cohesion was lost when Amelia High School was merged with our rivals at nearby Glen Estee High School in 2016 to form the West Claremont High School. By that point, what remained of a village identity was mostly gone.
And so I think it was more so the older generations who had that so much in that identity of Amelia or Glen Estee that really made it contentious. And how are we going to do this?
There wasn't pride in, I don't think, either of the schools, not the kind of pride that we had. And maybe by bringing the schools together in a new building, new state-of-the-art things, that it would push more people to have a desire to learn and actually be present in school.
While I still think that there's still some like white trashy vibes because everybody's like, it's Claremont County, it's West Claremont. I think that the community as a whole seems more proud of it because it's kind of a community center, and we've never really had that before.
The controversial income tax arose as a ballot proposition shortly thereafter, and with it came the rumblings of a dissolution. When the villagers went to the polls last November, 64% of them decided there was no need for a village anymore.
I don't think the elected officials held themselves in good light during the debates, and I think the residents let their redneck side fly.
People just didn't like Todd. They didn't like the mayor, and they just wanted to find a reason to get rid of him. And as soon as the schools merged, that was kind of the key like hit-off point.
I think that the village, the people who are running the village, took liberties that they probably shouldn't have. And I think that gave a distrust for the village.
I remember hearing the rumblings about how it had changed everything and it was going to cause the dissolve, and then silence. It was like the most non-monumental thing ever. Like, oh, we're not a village anymore.
And like the community that was built up around like kickball and tag started to fade away. It's funny because it feels like it evolved, not like disappeared.
It feels about the same as not having the high school that I went to. Like if you needed something from there, there's places you can get it, but it's just odd. You know?
We lost one another. Whether you were an Amelia teacher or a Glen Estee teacher, you lost your people.
She said something about the high school, and Ben's like, oh yeah, your high school doesn't exist. Your town doesn't even exist anymore. And I was like, damn, you're right. All of those things are true.
Looking back, I'm not entirely surprised that the residents voted against the village. They never felt like they had a lot in common with one another. They were already losing their sense of pride in the community. And I'm not sure I was ever too proud of it myself. We didn't realize we were living through the death throes until it was too late. Anything can break up a community without a shared sense of identity. In our case, it just took an additional 1% in taxes. Amelia was my hometown, but now it's just a wide spot in the road, and maybe that's how it's meant to be.